Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for Victoria University's Chancellor's Council Charter Day Luncheon. For those of you whom I haven't met, my name's Louise Yearwood, and I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Affairs and Advancement for Vic. And my team and I have the pleasure each year of organising this luncheon for Victoria's most active and dedicated supporters. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that your mics and videos are all turned off. With a large number of participants, we are running this session as a webinar, as this is the best way to ensure a good sound quality. As I'm sure you've all experienced over the past 7 months, technology is a wonderful but sometimes temperamental thing, and we do appreciate your patience in the event that we encounter any technical issues. I also want to let you know that we're recording this session in order that we can share the upcoming conversation between Vic's President and Chancellor with the broader Vic community after this special event. Finally, with respect to questions, for those who submitted their questions in advance, time permitting, a few of them will be posed to Chancellor Saul at the end of the programme. Now, let me officially begin our 2020 Chancellor's Council Luncheon by expressing our hope that everyone present today is safe and well and ready and able to enjoy the stimulating talk we have programmed for you shortly between Victoria's President William Robbins, who was reappointed in July this year to a second term of office, and its newly appointed Chancellor Nick Saul, Vic 9TO. As well, I want to take this opportunity to express our thanks to all our Chancellor's Council and President's Circle members and Heritage Society members for your support for the Vic community, most especially at this very challenging time in our global history. As is my practice on the occasion of the Charter Day Luncheon each year, I also want to take a moment to thank the Alumni Affairs and Advancement team for not only working to bring this event about, but also for their work throughout the year, most especially during the past 7 months of the pandemic. Despite the challenges imposed by the lockdown at a critical point in our fiscal year, we raised 98% of our goal of $4.5 million on the year. The team has been working from home since March, continuing to move forward with our shared work in the department despite the inherent challenges. The team includes an Alpha Order, Bennett Crusada, Sharon Gregory, Mary Heinmer, Helena Herskovici, Megan Junk, Alicia Lavalle, and Ruth Ann McIntyre, all of whom are on the call today. And I want to take this occasion to thank you all for the good work you do on behalf of Victoria University. And now, as is the tradition, I will list the names of those who have left bequests to Vic in the year past, followed by the names of those members who have passed away since the last year's meeting, for whom we will observe a brief moment's silence. And I will just add, for those of you who have come to this luncheon before, we will not be adding additional permanent members to the Council this year due to COVID-19. Of course, we would wish to honour new members in person, which is not, of course, at present possible. So the following may bequest gifts to Vic, which were received between May 2019 and September 2020. William G. Alexander, spouse of the late Ruth Manning Alexander, Vic 5TO. Ruth Bolt, Vic 4T3. Walter Bulichuk, 5T1. Kenneth Brian Burnham, 5T6. Raymond G. Carl, 5T6. Joan E. Connor. Nettie Wilson Hoffman, 5TO, Nina M. McFarland, 4T5, Shirley J. McIntyre, 5T2, Heather Onyett, 6T7, Robert J. Rooks, 5T3, Claire H. D. Walsh, 3T9, Robert W. Worthy, 5T1, and Maria Herkeko Zapatovich, 7T2. As well, there were 2 additional donors who wished to remain anonymous. And the following permanent Chancellor's Council members have passed away since our last luncheon together. Shirley M. Drummond, Vic 5T1. The Honourable G. Dennis Lane, Vic 5T4, Jean Little, Vic 5T5, Alastair M. Murray, Vic 5T7, and Donald H. Parr, Vic 5TO, and Emmanuel 5T3. Let us observe a brief moment's silence for these members of our community. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce William Robbins, President of Victoria University, to offer his greetings and to introduce today's special guest. President Robbins, over to you.
Thank you, Louise, and thanks to all of you who are present on the call today, to members of the Chancellor's Circle, the President's Circle, the Heritage Society, and of course to our new Chancellor, Nick Saul. Welcome to all of you. The Charter Day ceremony is our commemoration of the granting of the charter to Victoria University in 1836 by King William IV. And one of the things that is traditional on Charter Day is to have this Chancellor's Lunch, where I have the opportunity to share with you some thoughts on the current state of the university. So I thought I would do that first by telling you how we're responding to the very unprecedented situation of this COVID pandemic. The pandemic affects everything that we do at the university in so many ways, especially because so much has shifted online and we are connecting remotely for the most part. I should let you know that enrollments at both Victoria College and Emmanuel College are robust. In fact, they're increased slightly at both colleges, which is not the case at universities across North America. And I think this is a testimony to the fact that the kind of education that we provide both at Emmanuel College and at Victoria College that really focuses on questions of what it means to be human is very much in demand right now as the world is struggling with the pandemic. I should say that classes at Emmanuel College are entirely online. Classes at Victoria College are in a dual delivery mode, partly online, partly in person. Across the University of Toronto, about 10% of classes have some in-person component. At Victoria College, that's much higher. About 40% of our classes have some in-person component, especially our first-year offerings. The residences do have students in them, but only at about 1/3 of their normal capacity in order to make sure that students have their own rooms and their own bathrooms, and if need be, can self-isolate. We have no external or internal events happening at the moment, and many have shifted online, as has today's Chancellor's Luncheon. So that's a kind of picture of some of the changes that students are experiencing at Vic during this term, and certainly into the next term, it'll probably be very similar. There are many challenges presented by the pandemic for an institution like Victoria, whose identity is really based on small, person-to-person conversations where we're all present with each other. The shift to doing so much online and remotely has been a real challenge for our sense of identity, as we have had to maintain our sense of camaraderie, our sense of support for each other, and of being a caring community that's very close-knit. So while it's been very challenging, it's also been a time of great possibility, and actually a time where we've seen a huge amount of creativity and imagination on the part of our students and faculty and staff in adapting pedagogies to the new online system or the new dual delivery system. And also in terms of providing student services remotely through telephone and online, and above all, through creating community. The creativity and imagination has been shown nowhere so much as perhaps in orientation, which was entirely online this year, but it was run by the students and the Dean of Students office and had thousands and thousands of student connections with the offerings that we were providing through orientation. It was actually a great success. So while we are making some moves that will be just for the duration of COVID, many of the things that we are experimenting with will continue to be part of our offerings even after the pandemic ceases to concern us so much. So there are many things that we're going to hold on to as we emerge from this to make sure that Vic is even stronger. Besides responding to COVID, we are currently finalizing a 5-year strategic plan. This is what we were working on last year and was disrupted by the pandemic, but we're ready to get back to work on the final stages of that. The pillars of that are excellence in our academic mission, the incredible innovation of our high impact offerings for students, our incredible sense of community, and our inspiring campus environment, which now includes also thinking of our virtual presence, a kind of virtual campus through which we connect. Besides the strategic plan, we're doing many other things, including strengthening our undergraduate research opportunities, including expanding our award-winning Scholars in Residence program that occurs during the summer. We are scaling up a new initiative known as Vic Ready that helps prepare students for what comes after university, after a very successful pilot year last year, and in light of the fact that with the pandemic and the effects on the economy that it's having, many of our students have very serious concerns about how to prepare for what comes after university right now. We are also expanding our mental health resources, something that we were eager to do even before the pandemic struck, and now is even more important. And we are also working on increasing scholarships and bursaries, especially for students from groups who are currently underrepresented at Vic. Vic faculty and students and staff have all stepped up. They have been working very, very hard over the last 7 months to respond creatively and thoughtfully and quickly to the challenges that we face. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank publicly all of them, also all of our supporters and friends, including those of you who are on the call today. On behalf of the entire Victoria University community, thanks for all that you do. Now it's time for me to introduce our special guest today. It's actually the Chancellor's lunch, so he's in some ways his own guest here. This is Nick Saul, Victoria's 15th Chancellor. Nick is the co-founder and the CEO of Community Food Centres Canada, a national organization that builds and supports vibrant, food-focused community centres in low-income neighbourhoods across the country. Nick is a member of the Order of Canada. He is a recipient of the Jane Jacobs Prize, as well as the Queen's Jubilee Medal. He also has an honorary doctorate from Ryerson University. Born in Tanzania and raised in Canada, Nick studied at Victoria College at the University of Toronto and also at Warwick University in the UK as a Commonwealth Scholar. He started his term as Victoria University's Chancellor in May of 2020. There is much more I could say about Nick, but let's get into our discussion. So, Nick, if you could unmute, and there you are. There's Nick. Welcome, Nick.
So good to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction, Will.
Yeah. Well, Nick, my understanding is that your parents met at Vic and that there's a long Saul family tradition of attending Vic. Could you tell us a bit more about that family connection?
Indeed. Well, I think it's going to be 1923 it goes back. That's when my grandma, Dorothy Saul from the Sioux, graduated from Vic University. And so we go back a long way, as do many, many people who have deep and passionate connections to Vic. My aunt and uncle went to Vic. My parents met at Vic in 1958, as my dad says, in RK, which is religious knowledge class. And as the family lore goes, he popped his head up in the first class to say, "Who has those smelly egg salad sandwiches?" And it happened to be my mother who, well, my now mother who had those sandwiches. And so they met over a smelly egg salad sandwich. And then I continued to be connected to Vic. Obviously, I graduated there in 1990. I was there from 85 to 90. But before that, when I was in high school, I discovered that there was a beautiful gym at Emmanuel College. And so I would, how should I say this publicly, creatively found ways to get into the building to play basketball. So I have a long history with Vic, and am very humbled and honored to now be its chancellor. And I want to say that since becoming chancellor, so many people have reached out and talked about their own deep connections to Vic. And I also want to say, Will, that your introduction is a small sliver of the incredible work that is going into making Vic a vibrant place in this new scenario, and working overtime to create well-being for its students, its staff, and faculty. I've been completely blown away by your leadership, by the many staff there who are just incredibly invested in making Vic a special place. The Board of Regents, those volunteers, Lisa Koo, who's the chair there. I have been received with open arms. I've spoken to Carol Taylor. I've spoken to Wendy Cecil. I even had a conversation with Northrop Frye. One day I walked over and sat beside him and I said, what's your advice for being chancellor? And I think he said, it might have come from the big oak that's on the southeast part of the quad, but he said, just be yourself. So I have been welcomed, and people have been so generous and treated me so well. So it's a real honor to be here, and I'm deeply proud of my connection to Vic.
Well, I know the Vic community is also very inspired by the opportunity to have you as the chancellor. In that new role that you have as chancellor, what are some of the things that you'd like to focus on? I know that inclusion and, as you just mentioned, the well-being of students is a big topic. Are there some things that you would like to make a hallmark of your time as chancellor here?
Yeah, I mean, I think my life so far in terms of work, whether it's working with homeless men or organizing tenants in public housing, working with low-income communities here in Toronto, has always been about building community and belonging, and a place where people can feel respected and heard and valued. So I've done a lot of work in what I would say is maybe referred to sometimes in the community building world as the third place. So the place between home and work. And that could be a library, it could be a park, it could be a cafe, it could be a church. And in my case, in my day-to-day work, it's a community food center, and the community food centers we're building across this country. And of course, at Vic, it's Vic. And so I want to contribute to building a place where people feel valued and heard and can contribute. And I think you do that by making sure that the organization is representative of everyone who's there, whether that's at the Board of Regents level, whether that's in staff or faculty, and of course, having a very diverse group of students, and making sure that they see themselves in that space, that they feel represented, that they have a place to speak and share ideas and build relationships and build meaning. And I think that's super important, particularly in times of stress or when things go difficult. You need to build relationships so that you can actually navigate complexity. And if you don't build them and you kind of focus on just simple transactional relationships, then you're in trouble. So I want to, I say this in a very humble way, to contribute in continuing to make Vic a place where people feel heard and valued. So that's definitely one thing I'll bring to my role, however I can do it. And I'm still trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of what it is I'm supposed to do. I think the other thing that I think is very important is making sure that students in particular have a sense of their own agency, and that they lean into the public realm and move beyond the four walls of their own situation. I think sometimes, particularly in the communities, low-income communities that I work in, people forget that they have power and that they need to be supported to speak out. And similarly, students sometimes, I'm sure, can feel ignored or feel inconsequential. And let's be clear, we're living in a very, very difficult moment. There are deep divides around race, class, gender, and that's all against the backdrop of climate change. So droughts and cyclones and hurricanes. And so, it's a very difficult moment, but I will always take the opportunity to remind anyone who I have a chance to speak with, but in this case, I'm speaking, I hope I'll be speaking a lot to students, that they have a role to play in building a better future and in terms of how we come back. And so there are so many opportunities for people to engage, and whether that's around climate change or Indigenous reconciliation or Black Lives Matters, your voice is wanted and needed. There are so many roles you can play. And I want people to lean into the public. That public realm is so important. And we all need to be there in order to build back better and create a society where we're all included and our voices are heard. So that's an area that I hope that I'll be able to bring to the role. I also want to obviously talk about accessibility and making sure that campus represents the country. And I want to maybe push back a bit on the meritocracy idea where, just if you have skills and imagination that you're going to be able to get where you want to go. And that's simply not true. I mean, I know from my own personal experience, I had a lot of privilege, white privilege, class privilege, in spite of a very progressive home that I lived in. When I ran into trouble, I would get a tutor to help me through math. I had all sorts of benefits. I didn't have to work. And that's not the case for all students. So when you spoke about trying to make the campus, Will, earlier, more accessible to more marginalized groups who don't have opportunities, whether that's financial or when they get to campus, making sure that they're supported, that's a big piece of, I'll try and find some way to contribute to that. And then of course, I'm super interested in food. So how does food move from field to table? And what's the quality of the food? Where is it sourced? And how is it being used to ultimately do what I love to do, which is build community? So yeah, I have a few things that I hope I can contribute to over the coming years.
Well, that's terrific to hear. The connections between what you have just been talking about that you might focus on at Vic and the work that you've done at community food centers is very interesting. There you found one of those kind of third spaces where you can have an effect and, as you say, lean in to the public realm while affecting people's sense of what they can do. It's really amazing work. You've been helping build lives of individuals and of communities. I think some people who are on the call today will remember that in the Vic report in 2018, we featured the work that you were doing called Food for Fairness. Could you tell us a bit more about your work with the food centers, but also maybe how the pandemic is impacting the work that you're doing now?
Sure. Well, we live in a country with great wealth, and we are signatories to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and embedded in that is the right to food. And as a country, we don't do very well on that score. There are millions of our fellow citizens and neighbors who struggle to put food on their table each and every day, and that has huge ramifications on our healthcare system, their own sense of being and self-worth. Relationships breaking down, employment opportunities stymied. So we live in very difficult times, and I referred earlier to some of the divisions in our society that we need to overcome. And I found myself, after working with homeless men in shelters, organizing public tenants in housing, and trying to get them into better housing, I found myself working around food. And I'll never forget one of the first days I landed at what was then called Stop 103, which is our first community food center. I remember looking out the door and people were lining up, and we still had about 2 hours to open. And when the doors opened, they came in with their eyes on the ground, and they had all these very personal questions that they were asked, and they got to the front of the line and they weren't handed very healthy food, and off they went. And I looked at that and I said, wow, we need to do better. And so we created a community center ultimately, which was all about listening hard to what people wanted to have in their lives, that was more participatory and less stigmatizing, that was really creating a place. Again, these words will pop up whenever I speak around care and love and being valued and being heard. And we built a very different kind of community center built around good food. And it often started for people eating a plate of food that was cooked with a lot of love and intentionality. And in that plate of food, people saw that they mattered and that they had worth. And then they would look up from that meal and go, wow, look at the myriad of ways, from community gardening to participating in a cooking group, or to getting involved in an advocacy campaign, increasing social assistance rates, or getting their kid involved in cooking classes to learn that food doesn't grow on supermarket shelves, but really building a space where people mattered and could articulate their hopes and dreams in terms of what needed to change in their own lives and what needed to change writ large in society. And so that was the early going of building the community food center movement. And it was really a combination of respectful, dignified frontline programming in neighborhoods that desperately needed good space, that third place that I talked about, but also very clearly speaking out about the structural reasons, the structural inequalities that were forcing people into such difficult circumstances. People weren't poor because of poor budgeting decisions or a character flaw. People were struggling because they didn't have enough income to make the choices that they needed to make for themselves and their family. So we have always centered public policy and advocacy. So bringing together respectful programming with a real charge around changing the systems that pin people back. And so that has become the community food center movement. We started with that one, and I left there in 2012 to start a new national organization called Community Food Centers Canada that was going to have that same drive and purpose around space and advocacy. We now have 14 community food centers across the country, and we work with another 200 organizations that are working in the spirit of this model of grow, cook, share, and advocate. And we want to revolutionize the conversation around food in this country. It shouldn't be about people feeling less worthy or their eyes on their floor. It should be eating with others, feeling connected, and starting to talk about what needs to change in our systems. So yeah, that's the work I've been doing to date. And it has been complicated because of COVID, because of course, all our work is within the vein of upstream, preventative, skill building, and public policy change. And COVID forced all our organizations to move toward more emergency, which is appropriate. There's tremendous stress out there. And so our centers, the centers held, our people held, and they were there for their communities when it was needed the most. So we've gone to takeaway meals, we've gone to grocery gift cards, which we've given out millions and millions of dollars of grocery gift cards so people can walk into a supermarket and make the choices they need to make. Healthy food hampers. So we have moved to emergency, but also acknowledging that that's not the answer to food insecurity. Long before COVID hit, we lived in a society where 4.5 million of our neighbors struggled to put food on the table. And all of those fissures, those cracks, those fault lines have been exacerbated by COVID. So in fact, since COVID hit, food insecurity in this country has increased by about 39%. So our centers have been extraordinarily busy, and we have understood the importance of just making sure that people can eat. But we're also very, very focused on the larger public policy issues at play. So for example, CERB, the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit, that came out, that the feds came out with, has been extraordinarily important for people. It's been a lifeline for folks. And without it, we would have just been inundated on the front lines. But it's interesting that CERB, which is amounted to about $2,000 a month, is basically the poverty line. So if you're a single person in Canada, the poverty line is about $24,000. If you're two people, it's about 34. And if you're a family of four, it's 48. So CERB actually, while super important, exposed how inadequate our supports were. So for example, it was like 2 or 3 times more than you would receive on welfare in this country, and wouldn't come close to any EI payment you might get unless you're making like $21 or $22 an hour working full time. So we're really working hard to reshape the post-pandemic world. So it is about equity, foregrounds equity, and certainly ensures that whether people are working in the labor market, that they're being paid fairly and they're getting good benefits. And if they happen to fall out of the labor market, I should say that 65% of people who are food insecure in this country have an attachment to the labor market, which speaks volumes about how vulnerable and precarious our labor market is. But if they do fall out of the labor market, that we have really good supports for people, that we have a pharmacare program, that we have good childcare, that we have good and affordable housing and a housing benefit. So, we're trying to ride COVID in the sense that we got to be there for people. But as we start to emerge, we need to ensure that we have a very different kind of society. And Community Food Centres Canada is on the front lines of that conversation.
Well, it's so inspiring. And Nick, the advocacy work that you talk about and the need to think more broadly about the causes of food insecurity and come up with system-wide ways of addressing that obviously intersects with some of the concerns that we all have about inclusivity and equity. And these are concerns that I know are important to you. Could you talk a bit about about your thoughts on equity issues, and perhaps especially on say reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples, also the Black Lives Matter movement, or the other kind of big equity movements that are probably intersecting with the kind of food insecurity work that you're doing now?
Sure. As I said, when COVID hit, we were a deeply unequal society. And so if you just take some of the numbers I've talked about already, about 14% of people in Canada are food insecure. So food insecure, just for people who've never heard that term, it's not the best term to use, but it is about people not having enough income to put food on the table. So that's when I say food insecurity, that's what I mean, that there's inadequate or insecure access to food due to financial constraints. So 14% across the country. If you happen to be Black, that's 30%. If you happen to be Indigenous, it's about 30% as well. If you happen to live in a place like Nunavut in the far north, where we have a community food center in Iqaluit, it's over 57% of Inuit people in that part of the world, part of our country, are food insecure. So when you look at the hit of COVID, which disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, people of color, low-wage workers, women, young workers, it's been a heavy, heavy hit for those communities that already were behind. So, it is critical that we foreground those voices and those issues in the work we're going to do going forward. I am deeply concerned about numbers like the latest labor market numbers show that 17% of racialized communities are facing unemployment. If you're white, it's about 9%. If you're a worker earning minimum wage, listen to this, 23% of minimum wage workers either completely lost their job or lost more than 50% of their hours. If you earned 40% or more, negligible impact. So when COVID hits, those who are able to negotiate remote work with their employers, they're the privileged. Those who are able, when the supply chain around food was a bit shaky in the early days, they could go into a supermarket and buy extra food. So those were the people, if they actually contracted COVID, they could self-isolate in their home because they had an ensuite bathroom or they had space. That wasn't the case for Black, Indigenous, people of color workers who were on the front lines, who often lived in not good housing, had to show up for work on those front lines, and could definitely not afford to buy extra food because they were struggling to buy any food. So this is very much alive in my mind and in our organization's mind, and I know you're thinking about it at Vic, and I should say we are thinking about it at Vic as an important issue. And so, for example, around some of the public policy issues that we're pushing, we want to make sure that we have a race, equity, and impact assessment on all social policy that is aimed at reducing food insecurity and reducing poverty. Because what we're starting to see is, even with entitlements that are universal, when there's discretion involved in distributing those entitlements, Black, BIPOC populations don't fare as well, which speaks to systemic racism and the need to end racism. And yeah, I mean, yes, policies and procedures, but all of us have to come to terms with the fact that, particularly white, and I would say white men, that our privilege is enormous. And we need to interrogate that and figure out how it shows up in terms of unconscious bias, or just understanding our power and trying to make space for others to move in and have their voices heard. So that, I express some of the themes that I'd like to pick up on in my work at Vic, and it would be that, is ensuring those voices that have been traditionally pushed to the side come forward, because we're not at our best when we don't hear those voices. Black Lives Matter matters as a movement. The Indigenous reconciliation matters. We need to be listening and learning and standing side by side with our Indigenous brothers and sisters to make sure that they are valued and heard. So maybe you can tell that this is important to me personally, and obviously in the organization that I work in, it is core to making sure that how we build back is done equitably, because it wasn't working so well for many of our fellow citizens. And we need to admit that, acknowledge it, and interrogate it, and do better.
On that note, specifically around the universities and at Vic, I mentioned earlier that enrollments are actually fine at the University of Toronto, in fact, a bit up, but we're a bit worried, we'll get the data later, we're a bit worried that it might be up for certain groups in society and down for others, and especially for families that are struggling economically during the pandemic, maybe having to make some tough choices and choosing to stop their university study or to not start it at all. And we've been directing some of our scholarship and bursary efforts to meeting the needs of these students, not just in terms of monetary support, but also providing food, food plans at the dining hall and things to bring our students in. What advice might you have for some of our recruiting staff or our student-facing staff about how we could best help some of these students who are trying to make it at university, but maybe don't see themselves represented at university, or don't really have the innate knowledge that somebody whose parents and grandparents have been to university have about how the system works? Is there any thoughts about what we might be on the lookout for when we're talking with students and trying to help them through what's challenging in many ways for them?
So maybe I'll use a parallel for my current work. And I would say the singular most important issue related to food insecurity is income. So we know that income matters more than anything else in terms of where you sit on the pendulum of food insecurity, whether that's moderate, marginal, severe, or not at all. So I think that's super instructive from my perspective in terms of how we translate that into the university setting. Because we know that, for example, if you give a family the child benefit, their food insecurity is drastically reduced. And so that's an income benefit. It's netted out through our tax system. As soon as you become a senior in this country, so you move from precarious employment into old age security, guaranteed income supplement, CPP, food insecurity drops by 50%. So, when I talk a lot about, if you frame the issue of food insecurity as hunger, you get food responses and you get charity, versus framing it as poverty, you get policy and you get the right to food. Two very different ways to frame it. I'm obviously on the side of right to food framed as income, poverty policy. The same holds, I think, for students. And I would love, and Louise is hearing this, be involved in trying to raise money so that we can support students who have a myriad of needs around income, whether that's eating, and 1 in 6 kids in this country are food insecure. So whether that's money to eat, whether that's money for transportation, whether that's money to pay for tuition, it all adds up to ensuring that people who have great skills and great talents and so much to contribute are noticed and supported. So to me, I was on the Board of Regents meeting just recently, and I think it was one of the students from VUSAC was talking about a BIPOC scholarship or award. Well, if I can lend my hand, I wish I were a gazillionaire so I could write a check, but I'm not that. But I want to help to corral dollars to ensure that more and more, that the university breathes its surroundings, that the people who are there are from Jane and French. They're from our city, they're from our country, and those people come from all walks. And it's important to provide support. And that's, my comments about meritocracy and the importance. Equity is about acknowledging difference and supporting people to make sure that they're on the same field. And scholarships and awards are about one means to do that. And I certainly will bring as much energy and passion as I can to make that happen so more people can benefit from an extraordinary community that is Vic.
Have you had a chance to eat at Burwash Hall yet? You became Chancellor in May after we kind of closed things down, or if not at Burwash, at some of Chef Antoine's other offerings, or is that something we'll have to wait until we can gather together for?
Well, I am super excited to taste Chef Antoine's food, but I have to date not had the opportunity. And I want to have the chance just to sit down and talk to him about why he's so passionate about food, because I love talking to people who see the world through the lens of food, because I really think that if we can rethink food, we can rethink the world, because food is about inclusion, it's about recognizing your culture, it's obviously about equity, it's about health. And let's be clear, if everyone eats, then we have a fair, more inclusive, more just society. So Chef Antoine, here I come. I'll be, I don't want to state that too strongly, but I look forward to it. And I hope I can introduce him, for example, to some incredible farmers. And, this is a financial question. I mean, good food costs more money. And so, these are kind of issues where we need to grapple with. And what are the benefits of making sure that we're sourcing food, for example, from a regenerative farmer who's really taking care of the soil, paying their workers fairly. And so when that food arrives, that it has actually been thoughtfully sourced. Obviously, Chef Antoine will have thoughtfully put it together with his crew, but that it has values on the plate. And we need to be thinking about our values always, and they need to foreground the planet and people at all times. And there are costs to that. Well, let's get used to a new cost structure, and because that's important, because it'll save us down the road, no question. Particularly when we're looking at climate change roaring at us.
Well, Nick, I think everybody on this call will hear the passion you have for the work that you're doing, and the passion that you're bringing to your role as Chancellor at Vic. We do, in our last minute, have time for some of the questions that have been sent in from our audience. These were submitted in advance. We have time for a few of these. One of them is, you've started to address this already, but you might have more to say after some of the rest of the conversations we've had. Dear Chancellor Saul, what do you see as solutions to the chronic food shortages globally and in Canada?
Well, I don't profess to be an expert on global issues. I mean, I could probably work my way around it, but I'll focus on Canada for this. And it won't come to any surprise, to any person's surprise on this call that it's about ensuring people have not only income but good social policy, and that's meted out equitably. So we just released a report on food insecurity in Canada called Beyond Hunger. I'd be happy to share that with whomever wants to see it. And what's important about it is that it speaks to the very real stresses that people are under. So it's not just about a lack of food. It's about someone saying that I can't put my daughter into ballet because I can't feed her enough energy to participate. I do not have anyone come over for dinner because I have no food to give them. I can't go to a birthday party and see my friends because I can't afford to buy a birthday present. I mean, these are the stories that are out there. They're out there everywhere. So we got to listen to those stories. But when we start to talk about solutions, it's about ensuring that the child benefit is increased. It's about making sure that the disability tax credit is made refundable. So people in the disability community can have more income in the pocket so that they can make good choices, the choices that they want to make. It's making sure that we have a good pharmacare program. 20% of our neighbors don't fulfill their prescriptions because they can't afford to. We should have a national pharmacare program. Housing is off the charts expensive. We need to ensure that there's a housing benefit. The feds have been a bit slow in getting this out the door. They've committed to it. They've committed to the right to housing, but they need to make sure that they get that out the door. We are talking quite aggressively at Community Food Centres Canada, I mean that in a positive way, in a respectful way, about a refundable working age tax credit for workers. Because as I mentioned earlier, 65% of people who are food insecure are connected to the labor market. So we got to make sure that if they fall below whatever that floor that we want to name as our floor, that no Canadian should fall below. And that's something that we're really pushing for. And CERB has helped because it said that no one should really fall below this floor. Well, before CERB, many were falling below that floor. So I mean, this is kind of technical policy stuff, but in essence, what it adds up to is creating a range of supports that allow people to chase down what they want to be. And I think the big question for us as a society is, do we want to be hoarders or do we want to be sharers? And I know where I come down on that equation, and I'm sure most people, everyone on this call would say the same, that we want to share. And we live in a deeply inequitable place right now, and that can change. And so some people are going to have to give up some stuff so that others can participate. Because what the data shows is that people are living diminished and shortened lives because of their poverty. So we got to move.
Well, thank you, Nick. And there's one other question. I've got two more. One is, when you think back on your time at Vic, is there a particular professor or course that you feel influenced your career path?
Good question. Good question. Stephen Dupre, Darkness at Noon, 12 o'clock, 12 to 1 in Fry Hall. And he would get up, he got those glasses, and I think he always wore a suit, and he just pounded politics into us. And so that was a course that I was both terrified about, but also learned a lot in. So yeah, look, I have very fond memories. I also played varsity basketball, so I can't profess to say I spent a ton of time at Vic other than breaking into it when I was in high school. And then it was obviously my administrative home. And I remember there was one moment, I think during Frosh Week in '85, when I was supposed to stay overnight in one of the dorms. And I think at about 11 o'clock, I got on the museum subway and took 2 stops, St. George and Spadina, and went home. I was a homeboy, but I lived very close to campus. Yeah, I would say, I won't ever forget that poli-sci class. And of course, politics. I mean, I think it's a contact sport and you avoid it at your peril. And I worked at Queen's Park for a while as well, which is just down the road from Vic. And I learned very, very quickly that politics matters deeply, and we all need to engage with it, which is another theme that I want to be pushing with students, that they have a role to play, not necessarily as an elected politician. I wouldn't for a minute suggest that. There's so much going on in civil society, and those politicians, the oxygen is us out here pushing them to do better.
Well, that leads well to our final question, which was submitted. If you could offer one piece of advice to those incoming students to Vic in this unusual year, what would it be?
Don't be shy. You know, grab whatever you can. There's so much going on there. Like, I've been so impressed by Emmanuel College doing its Connect stuff and creating a virtual home for people. There's so much going on. Kelly Castle, Dean of Students, is extraordinary things, and the students themselves, the commuter dawns, the fun social activity stuff that's happening on social media. So I really encourage people to just find your community wherever it is. And look, I can't imagine any first-year student imagine that they would be sitting in their parents' basement apartment online, missing quite a lot of vitality on campus, although you spoke about 40% of the classes are actually in person. So I'm really glad to hear that, because I think that first year is really critical to building relationships that are obviously long lasting. I can't tell you how many people I've bumped into in the short time I've been chancellor who've said, I met my best friend and this extraordinary community in my first year at Vic, and we won the Mulock Cup 3 years in a, anyway, you know, on and on. So yeah, I don't know if that's the most articulate way of saying it, but like, you know, grab what you can, because it's there. And then as you make your way in, there will be space made available for you to be heard, and you need to speak. And I think that that's a very important thing, that we forget that we have a voice and that it matters, and you need to engage. You need to engage. And I want to help draw that out in the student body.
Well, that I think brings us to the end of our time and of this interview. But Nick, it's absolutely inspiring to hear about the work that you've done with the Community Food Centers of Canada, and the passion that you bring to it. And as I say, to hear about your thoughts about what you might be able to do as Chancellor at Vic, and to help the students and the staff, as well as the administration, think through some of these really difficult issues that our whole society is facing right now. So let me thank you once again, Nick, for offering us these insights and agreeing to be interviewed today at the Chancellor's Lunch. Thanks to those who submitted questions as well. And I will now pass things back over to Louise Yearwood to wrap up today's Chancellor's Luncheon. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. Well, that does conclude the Chancellor's Luncheon for 2020. I want to thank each of you on the call today for your presence. And I would especially, of course, like to thank Chancellor Saul and President Robbins for their participation. So be safe, be well, and thank you all very much for joining us today. Bye-bye.